Students, we are back starting a brand new unit today, a unit on polynomials. And our first goal is we want to be able to name polynomials. All right, if we're going to do this whole unit called polynomials, let's figure out what a polynomial is, and let's figure out how to talk about it, how to be able to name it and use these vocabulary words. Okay, so we're going to find there's actually three ways to name a polynomial. A polynomial can be named by its degree, by its size, and by its type. So let's start with the first one, a polynomial's degree. So here's an example of a polynomial. Now this is a rather large polynomial. And if you count it out, this polynomial actually has 7 terms, I believe. 4, 5, 6, 7. Well, what you're going to find out is that each of these terms, there's 7 terms in this polynomial. Every one of them has a name. All right, we've already learned what 3 of them are called. Let's actually work in reverse here. This term here at the very end that doesn't have a variable at all, it's just the number 3. We've already learned this is called a constant term. Constant because if something doesn't have a variable, that means it's never going to change. It's always going to be the same. This will always be a 3 regardless of what x is equal to. All right, kind of moving up the line here. Here we have the term 9x. This just has a single x. The x is to the first power. This is called a linear term. Linear terms, this is what we studied in Unit 1. It's kind of one of the most essential terms in all of algebra. All right, now this next term should look very familiar to you. We just did an entire unit on terms where the x is being squared. When you have an x squared, this is called a quadratic term. So the term is technically negative 8x squared. This term, we can name this entire term by calling it a quadratic term. So all of these should be familiar to you. We've already learned all 3 of these. Let's get into some new ones then, shall we? What about x to the third? If we have an x to the third, you could take a guess on this. A lot of times students can guess this one correctly. It is called cubic. 2x to the third is called the cubic term. Continue moving up the line. Here we have an x to the fourth. Now x to the fourth, this one's very hard to guess. The word is quartic. Think of a quart. A quart, there's 4 quarts in a gallon. Sometimes that helps students remember this. Or 4 quarters in a dollar. This one's called quartic. By the way, cubic kind of makes sense because a three-dimensional box is called a cube. Sometimes that's how people remember this. Now, after quartic, they just get kind of hard to memorize. This one kind of sounds similar to quartic. It's called quintic. Quintic is x to the 5th. So this term 9x to the 5th is called a quintic term. And then, and actually a good way to remember this, if you've ever heard of quintuplets. If a lady has 5 babies all at the same time, they're called quintuplets. Same thing, this is quintic. And then think about if a lady has 6 babies at once, there's a name for it. They're actually called sextuplets. X to the 6th, this is called sextic. 4x to the 6th is called the sextic term. All right, now that's as high as we're going to go. There's more. X to the 7th is like septic, and x to the 8th is octic. There's names you could look up, go to like Wikipedia. There's names beyond these, but these are the ones I'm going to expect you to know for this unit. Okay? Now, when we look at the polynomial as a whole, if we take this entire polynomial as one large problem and we were to ask, hey, what is the degree of this polynomial? Well, what you do is you go with the highest exponent. The highest exponent here is x to the 6th. We would say this entire polynomial is sextic. Now, you can also say 6th degree. Since sextic is to the 6th power, you could say that the degree is either sextic, or you could use it numerically and say the degree is that it's to, the entire problem is to the 6th degree. Now, a lot of times it'll be written in this order, but that's not necessarily the case. You could have it in like a different order, and whatever's the highest, that would be the degree. Now, another vocabulary word, that's the leading coefficient. The leading coefficient would just be the coefficient of your highest term. Since my highest term here is this sextic term, my leading coefficient, or my LC, would just be equal to the 4. This 4 right here is called the leading coefficient. And I think this is a good time to point this out. A lot of times your polynomials will be kind of written, this is called written in descending order. But let's just suppose for a second you had a problem where they were not in descending order. Okay, here's a polynomial right here where the highest degree is actually this third degree. So here for the degree of this particular problem, for the degree, you would say that it's cubic or third degree. Okay, even though this isn't like the leading term, it's not the term at the very beginning, the 5x is at the beginning, it's still the highest term. So we'd say this is third degree because it has an x to the third. And then likewise, the leading coefficient then would not be the 5, the leading coefficient would actually be the 2. All right, so that's an introduction to what's called the degree of a polynomial, and also a little bit of background on what's called its leading coefficient. Okay, so that's one way to name a polynomial is by its degree. Now let's go to the next one. Let's go to its size. So a polynomial can come in different sizes. Now I already said the first example we looked at had 7 terms. Okay, so that's a really large polynomial. But not all polynomials are so large. So the word monomial, the word mono actually means one. And then nomial means, it basically means name, but in this case it means term. A monomial is one term. So if you had any polynomial, let me just write an example. So like 5x squared, y squared. This is just one term. This polynomial doesn't have any addition or subtraction. Now it does have 2 variables, which is kind of unique. We're going to focus mainly on polynomials with just one variable. But if there's no addition or subtraction in a problem, that's just considered one term. Okay, so all of this is just one term. We would call this a monomial. Now on the other hand, a binomial would be a polynomial that has 2 terms. So if we had something like 3x plus 7, since there is an addition in this polynomial, it separates us into 2 terms, a 3x and a 7. That's called a binomial. And then trinomial means 3 terms. So if we had like 2x minus 5y plus 3. Here we have an addition and a subtraction. It divides it into 3 terms. This is called a trinomial. And then if you ever go beyond that, if you ever have more than 3 terms, you can just generically call it a polynomial. Polynomial means many terms. So like the very first example we looked at up above had 7 terms. We could call it a n-termed polynomial. You could say you have like a 7-termed polynomial. If you ever go above 3 terms, if you ever have 4 terms or 5 terms or 6 or 7, you would just write it out like this. This is the example up above was a 7-termed polynomial. All right, and then lastly, you can also name a polynomial by its type. There's 3 types of polynomials. There's an expression, an equation, and a function. Okay. Now an expression has no equal sign. So as an example, if I had like x squared plus 8x plus 12, and that was it, and there's no equal sign, this is called an expression. Now compare that to an equation. An equation has an equal sign. And furthermore, an equation with a polynomial not only is it going to have an equal sign, but it's going to be equal to 0 if it's in standard form. So if I take this exact same problem here, but I set it equal to 0, like x squared plus 8x plus 12 equals 0, now it's no longer called an expression, now it is called an equation. Okay. Now there's also a different type of an equation, a very specific type of an equation called a function. A function is, it is still an equation because it has an equal sign, but specifically with a function is either going to be equal to y or it's going to be equal to f of x. Any equation that leads off with a y equals or an f of x equals, this is called a function. So if I took this same problem here and made it y equals 2x squared plus 8x plus 12, now this would be called a function. So here's an example of all 3 types. All 3 of these are very similarly related. they all have the same, they're all trinomials with 3 terms. They all have like the same terms. The difference is this one has no equal sign, it's an expression. This one's equal to 0, it's an equation. This one's equal to y, it is a function. And one last note about these. Each of these types kind of has their own unique purpose. So if you see an expression, you actually cannot solve an expression. Expressions are just meant to be simplified or factored. Okay, you can't solve an expression. All we could try to do is break this into factors or simplify it, combining like terms. So like here I could look at this and say x plus 6 and x plus 2, these would be called the factors of the expression. An expression has factors. It doesn't have solutions, it has factors. Now compare that to an equation. An equation is meant to be solved. The purpose of an equation is you're trying to solve for this very specific value of x. So an equation actually has solutions. You'd say x equals negative 6 and x equals negative 2 are solutions. Okay. Now our last example, the function. Functions are actually meant to be graphed. The whole purpose of a function is you want to be able to graph it. And with functions, you're not looking for specific values of x. With functions, you're trying to analyze all of the values of x, usually within the context of a graph or a table. So a function, it doesn't have solutions. It has either a graph that you can draw, or you could say that negative 6 and negative 2 are actually called the zeros of the function. Okay, so with that in mind, let's look at just a couple examples off of your homework. So here is your assignment, name polynomials. Question 1, identify the following polynomial by its degree, size, and type. Okay, well the degree, this has an x to the 5th in it, so that's called quintic. You can also call it 5th degree, but I believe here it's called quintic. It gives the specific name. All right, the size. So when you look at size, you actually, let's do type first. The type is that this is a function. It has the f of x. Well, when you have an equation or a function, you actually only count what's on one side of the equal sign. So here's my equal sign. If I count to one side of the equal sign, I have one term, two terms. I have the quintic term and the constant term. There's two terms. This is called a binomial. And hey, you're going to sound so smart when you put this all together. Put this all together, we are left with, this is a quintic binomial function. Okay, don't you sound smart when you're saying that? All right, let's look at question 2. So question 2, my highest exponent is a 2, so my degree is quadratic. Now this one clearly has 3 distinct terms. There's no equal signs to mess with, so that doesn't even matter. It has 3 distinct terms. That's called a trinomial. And then like I already said, there's no equal sign. That is called an expression. So put this all together. You're going to sound really smart if you want to impress people today at the lunch table. Say, hey, today in math class we learned about quadratic, trinomial expressions and quintic binomial functions. You put all these words together, you're going to start sounding very smart. All right, hey, wish you best on this assignment. Once you get the hang of it, this takes a little bit of practice, but once you get the hang of it, I think you'll do fantastic. Take care.